Guys, we're gonna call to order in a minute.
It's really so sophisticated.
The time now is 7:05. My name is Shannon McHugh. I am chair of this commission. I'm going to call to order the Commission on Community Relations and Human Rights of the City of Oneonta, September 23rd, 2021, 7 p.m. First, we will do roll call. So, Commissioner Deandra Singetti-Daniels.
Here.
Commissioner Joyce Miller.
Here.
Commissioner Rever Marty.
Here.
Commissioner Franklin Chambers.
Here.
Commissioner Paul Conway.
Here.
Commissioner Carol.
Here.
And our council member liaison, Luke Murphy.
Here.
And myself are here. That means we are full this evening. Everyone is here. It's excellent. We are going to go ahead. Did everyone get a chance to look at the minutes that Joy sent out from August 26th? Did anyone have any questions, comments, remarks, changes? Did anyone want a little bit of time to look at it?
Move for acceptance.
Second.
Okay. So we have a first and a second.
Yes.
Yes.
We'll take a vote. All those in favor of passing the August 26th minutes, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? None. Any abstentions? So our minutes from August 26, 2021 are passed. We chose as a commission 2 months back to make this meeting devoted to speaking with Acting Chief Witzenberg. We've invited him. He accepted our invitation.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
So he is here this evening. And the commission had a few questions and we're just curious about some things. So thank you so much for being here. We appreciate your time. And so let's move forward.
Yeah, I think if we want to do like a circle, start off and have them,
Well,
we can just go with our.
we have some questions that we talked about and kind of agreed upon ahead of time.
Okay.
So if it's okay, if you don't mind us just kind of asking you, and obviously, like if you feel like you don't have the information, you can just, you know, say you'd want to look into it or something. But we had a couple things in particular we were curious about. The first being, what are the current tasing practices for OPD?
Well, tasers are employed as a less lethal form. They are above verbal and fall in line with open hand techniques. They're used to gain compliance for non-compliant people. They offer us a option of being able to use that in lieu of, let's say, strikes, kicks, baton strikes, and we carry batons, and obviously firearms. So they fall into what we call the force continuum. And if we have somebody that's actively resisting arrest, then we can deploy that as an option based on circumstances.
What I'm like statistic wise, what would you like? How often are we utilizing tasers?
I would say a couple of times a year. I'd have to look for the actual specific numbers. We would have those. I do not have them with me right now. I can get them for you.
But generally, like not more than 20 or 50. Like,
Oh no,
Okay.
No, a handful.
Handful of times a year.
Yeah. We might have had 2 deployments this whole year.
Okay. And one of those cases was for Mr. Montgomery's case.
Yes.
Okay. Any idea what the other case was?
And then off the top of my head, no.
Okay. That's cool. Alright. Now, generally, if you have 4 officers and you're trying, as in this scene with Mr. Montgomery, and tasers are being used, I guess I'm trying to think of like, if you have 4 officers and you're trying to detain one person, it would have, like, I guess what I'm curious about is the level of fight or pushback that you're getting that you would have 4 officers and still need to use tasers.
Well, clearly the goal is not to hurt someone, so that's paramount, right? We want to get them into custody without hurting them. 4 people can have very different jobs. The subject in this case has 2 arms, and each one of those arms you have to control them somehow. So if you have somebody that has legs, you want to make sure you're controlling their legs because they've got to be able to, you can't let them get up. You might have somebody that's watching the crowd. And in this instance, I think there's very limited activity from one police officer, but 2 effectively were hands-on with him.
I guess my concern wasn't that how many people were hands-on, it's that was it necessary to have the, like, if we had that many people there, was the taser necessary? Because it happened really quickly. It escalated really quickly.
There was many warnings given prior with continued lack of compliance while he was still standing. We don't know what the intent of someone is when we're trying to handcuff them. And handcuffing people is tricky business. It's dangerous for everyone involved. So the longer it takes to get cuffs on someone, the more concern there is. So this was a concerted resistance.
Okay. Are tasers, is there any like correlation in utilizing tasers with someone who's intoxicated or using drugs? Like, is there any type of like possibility they could be harmed more so or subject to more heart issues from tasers being used?
I believe Tasers got several scientific studies that they've published. I think that's all open information that I'm aware of. I think it's safer to use the taser than to fight with somebody in a prolonged way. That creates additional stress as well.
Okay, but like for the few the tasings I didn't think there were many. The few tasings we've had, has the people, or would you not know, have they been intoxicated?
I know we've tased several intoxicated people.
Okay.
I can give you one example of someone that was in a drug-induced delirium several years ago. It was actually one of our first taser deployments, and that subject produced a 10-inch kitchen knife, and we used the taser on that individual with some success, but it still required 8 of us to get him into handcuffs.
Okay. So if the taser hadn't been used, what would have the methods been if the taser hadn't been deployed?
In this particular instance?
Specifically Mr. Montgomery's.
Well, justifiable force under the law at that point would be subject to, physical impact strikes, joint locks, manipulation of the limb, pain compliance, pressure point techniques. There's several.
Okay. So there's no like protocol on when we come up to a scene and we're trying to get everyone contained. we're just containing the person that's causing the most drama at that moment, or is like the most worrisome for your safety?
Well, yeah, I mean, it would be a triage. You know, we would look at the totality of circumstances at that point and have to make a decision as to who's the biggest threat at that moment.
Okay, and that's okay. Because in this situation, everything happened so quickly, and onlookers were yelling that he hadn't done anything. And so I guess there was this curious point to, you know, if they had just taken a few extra minutes to talk to onlookers, that there could have been a different outcome. And
That was something that was attempted. There's some critical perspective that was lost in the video that was publicly broadcast. There was an attempt to have a discussion with who they thought was the initial aggressor, but before the officers were even able to exit the vehicle, they were presented with another issue. That's part of this. I don't want to speak into too great a detail because I don't have confirmation that this is a closed court case at this point. So speaking in detail regarding this publicly, I think could potentially be injurious to the case.
okay, I mean, that's kind of why we're trying to keep it just, you know,
Cool.
huh?
I actually just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about before the tasing and when police arrived. I think, and I don't want to talk for everyone on the commission, but again, watching the video and then seeing the initial response to the police officers pull up to the scenario. Obviously, like you were saying, that there were different points of views. My main takeaway was the lack of acknowledgement from the officers on their approach when they decided to approach the group of black men, specifically Mr. Montgomery. And I was curious if there was any kind of discussion afterwards on steps to move forward to prevent a tasing. I know you mentioned some other options besides tasing, but I think again my takeaway was how the police weren't as sensitive as I think they could have been pulling up to a situation like that, especially because it was such a heated thing. It appeared that they had tunnel vision.
Their focal point originally was not Mr. Montgomery. So he wasn't a focal point until he became one.
Right. So I think, again, from the video, I was saying that when they arrived on the scene, people, like Shane was saying, were saying, hey, you got the wrong guy. And it didn't seem that those cheers or things affected their decision to continue on their path. And I'm wondering if afterwards, everyone was in their respective safe spaces, was there reflection on how they could have handled the situation better, more appropriately, relied more heavily on de-escalation tactics besides using a taser?
We had discussion, the sergeant did, regarding the incident afterward, but there wasn't, what I can tell you is that the original person that we were looking at was subsequently arrested.
Mainly, my concern was not this particular situation, but future ones. So again, you're always thinking about the future and how we can do better. And I was curious if this was used as a learning opportunity for better de-escalation.
They always are. The officers always use these as an experience moving forward. In this instance, there was some discussion about what might have mitigated the reaction when we pulled up, which was a negative reaction, and it was to our arrival on scene that was negative. So we didn't have control over the reaction of the individual people. We were simply subjected to their action and had to make a decision as to what it was we were going to do to resolve that situation. And it was really out of our control as to how it was unfolding at that moment.
I would like to give you a little bit more credit that you don't have control over a crowd. But I think, again, not to thing is, my concern is that the police should have anticipated a negative reaction to arriving on a scene, especially in this current climate, especially given the individuals involved. And I'm concerned that that really wasn't addressed on, especially since you just said you didn't address it yourself, the sergeant did. And was it formalized? Was it over like at the water cooler? Like how was it discussed? Like, you know what I'm saying? So the idea that in 2021, police officers are not even responding, they drove past, that's my understanding, to a situation with a black male and didn't think, hey, maybe they might not perceive me pulling up to them, at 2 or in the morning after the bars. So that's what I was wondering on why that reflection or discussion hasn't happened. Or, well, excuse me, I was asking if it happened, and it sounds like it didn't. Now I'm asking why didn't it happen?
Well, it did happen, and one of the things that we discussed was them stopping further back to get a better size up, but I don't know if that, you know, we can second guess this forever. It doesn't mean that the reaction that we got was gonna be any different.
Oh.
So we did discuss how we could have a softer approach coming up to the scene, but at that point, when we have physical confrontations, especially on Main Street, I've seen people behave very violently with or without intervention from the police. We've de-escalated things that we hadn't taken custodial action on that have resulted in property damage, physical injury, and when you look back on that, in my career, I found that it's much better to, especially given the use of intoxicants, give people a safe place to go and some supervision, rather than allowing them to continue on their emotionally charged and intoxicated behavior. So, in this particular instance, the subject was not Mr. Montgomery, but he became the suspect, the subject of their attention.
I'm sorry. You said that the response that took place was due to not feeling in control of the scene. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, say that again?
The response that took place that evening, was that it because the officers did not feel in control of the scene due to bystanders' remarks and them not being able to?
No, not at all. They arrived there and were presented with a condition that needed attention. There was not and we were talking about a lot of people yelling, a chaotic scene. Somebody presenting themselves as a potential threat and somebody that's escalated. They made a point of trying to have Mr. Montgomery back up, which he didn't do. And ultimately, the decision was made to take him into custody for disorderly conduct.
I think another thing that I'd like to ask was the commentary in the background of the video. Again, the video is mostly while you're here because the public had views of the situation. In the background, well, not people, one person in particular was saying, accusing your officers of misusing drugs, particularly steroids. And I was curious if you took that allegation seriously, how the follow-up of that, or what happened. Was that discussion?
Can I take this one just from a personal standpoint? So, drug testing is a term and condition of employment under the New York State Taylor Law, which is what governs our unionized employees. We have a negotiated reasonable suspicion policy. What reasonable suspicion is actually has to meet a legal definition. There has to be contemporaneous and articulable reasons for a person to believe that an officer or an employee is under the influence. And that has to be done by a trained substance abuse person within the department or up here or me or whoever. So I think that sometimes it's not just as easy as somebody, on Main Street when there's a lot of things going on saying, oh, that they're abusing steroids. I mean, it's something that we take very seriously, but there are legal and negotiated parameters that we are required to follow as a city and as an employer to be sure that we're, meeting the legal standards and the definition, if that makes sense.
I think for me, just I can speak for myself, is that this isn't the first time this has been alleged. Actually, I've mentioned it to Chief Winsenberg in the summer, months before this happened. So when you're hearing the same things over and over again, under the law, would that not be enough to say, hey? And if so, why isn't that a concern? If that's a concern for the public, that should be a concern for the department.
Sure. And I think it definitely is a concern. I would also add that, again, recognizing that drug testing is a term and condition of employment, it is a requirement that that policy and procedure be negotiated. We have a negotiated procedure for testing for 5 substances. Steroids is not one of them.
Okay, but nothing against providing education and support, right? So we could effectively be providing an education and support to them versus drug testing them. Okay, because I feel like, even if we were testing them and say stuff came up, they still need education and support. So we can try to move that route in relation to the drugs because, even in the reform board, it came up about drug use from community members that were concerned. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is there any other steps besides drug testing that the department is doing currently to ensure that their officers are not misusing drugs? I don't know. I know I'm looking at you, but I don't know if that's a question you could answer.
If I had reasonable suspicion to believe that any of my officers were using drugs, they would be in for testing.
So no. I think that police officers typically are under a lot of stress. And we know that stress and being overworked and working a lot and having a lot of pressure results in drug usage sometimes. So I'm wondering if there's any programs you have currently to help monitor police officers' mental health and drug usage.
Support.
Because they go hand in hand.
I treat my department like a family.
You do.
I make sure that they are attended to as far as what they have going on in their personal lives and make sure that they're supported in any emotional way that I can. I've gone so far as to get because we can't force mental health evaluation or treatment, I've gone so far as to get a chaplain to come in so that they have an outlet, somebody to talk to that's not one of the other officers within the department. I make a point of checking in with them and monitoring occasionally audits of interactions with the public to make sure that they are living up to the expectations set forth by my office. And again, if I thought that there were reasonable suspicion in this instance, then we would have obviously we would go ahead with policy as allowed.
I should also add that I appreciate the point that you're making about, looking at mental and emotional health as a comprehensive, holistic, view of employee wellness. So I would say that, even in the last 6 months, I think that collectively, Greg, Acting Chief Witzenberg and I, and Retired Chief Mancini on the fire department and I, recognizing that there's a particular and unique stress that's created and caused by the nature of the work for our first responders in both sides of our public safety departments, both police and fire. We didn't widely publicize it, but Chris and Greg and I recruited a national mental and emotional health speaker, especially on PTSD and just general emotional wellness, to come in. We had a really nice program. Out of that program, we're having through the IAFF, which is the International Association of Firefighters, a peer support network that's being created. So we're actually going to be having training, and we're having people come in from that organization to be first line of defense in terms of mental, emotional, psychological well-being and intervention. And I think that that's a really big step. Chris and I are evaluating options for, kind of ramping up our EAP program, which is the Employee Assistance Program. We have a clinical psychologist, Dr. Sally George. She has an office locally. We incorporate her in a lot of things that we're doing. So often, whenever we have an officer, or even if on the other side of the building with our fire department, if there's a particularly challenging call or a really bad day, or we're noticing a performance concern or anything that would fall into an emotional well-being category, we're constantly making officers and our firefighters aware that there's resources available to them. So I think that in general, we are starting to do more by really placing an emphasis on that type of wellness for all of our first responders. So I'm pretty proud of those things. So I think that we are moving in the right direction. Is there room for improvement? Absolutely, every hour of every day. And we're certainly happy to take into consideration any suggestions that any of you might have for how we can continue to improve and rebuild and revamp that program.
Thank you. So they have access to a counselor should they ever want one.
20%.
And that is the local person that you spoke of?
Dr. Sally George, yep, she's very good. Again, she's a clinical psychologist. There's also other resources in the community, and we're actually, Chris and I and Greg were talking earlier about exploring another option. Like Chris said, the kind of the soft approach of having a chaplain. That person, is Paul Mesner. He's also, a large part of the community. He's somebody who's known and trusted and well respected. He's somebody who is a friendly ear and can help and encourage and listen, which is kind of oftentimes what we find our folks need. And I think that that's been a very helpful approach as well.
Because Chris is just one person, so he needs some help. So having outside resources and an outside counselor, I think the biggest thing for me would be like, okay, so if there is something tragic that happens, you guys still cannot suggest or have them go to a counselor. They have to choose to, correct?
I would say that, okay, I take my personal and my professional approach to counseling is that if it is mandated, it almost appears as though it's punitive. Our approach in bringing this PTSD speaker in who cried in front of a group of, our toughest public safety people who are being called upon to, go into some of the most horrific circumstances, we're really trying to attempt amongst us to break down the stigma of mental health or the perception of weakness if you ask for help or if you need to see a counselor. So to answer your question, Shannon, can we require it? Can we mandate it? Yes, we could. Just like we could any other sort of medical service. Do we like to do that? I'm sorry?
I'm sorry. In the past, I was told you that wasn't possible.
I think that,
I was told that you couldn't require or mandate any officer to go seek counseling.
Well, there has to be specific conditions under which you would do that.
well, right, because there, we have, governing Americans with Disabilities Act law, and if we're truly going to view psychological health just as we would any other medical condition, then of course we have to be careful in how we handle that. We couldn't send somebody, who appeared to be completely fit for duty off for a fitness for duty exam and say we want them to be evaluated for hearing or any other thing. I think it really comes back down to that contemporaneous, articulable, objective criteria. Theoretically, given the nature of the work that our folks are doing, I think that at any time we could make the justification after a particularly difficult call or a particularly difficult week, we could say that we have justification to do it. However, again, my approach professionally has always been we want to do everything we can to encourage and support before we would mandate. Because again, we want people to approach it with an open mind and not to see counseling or help as anything that's ever punitive, because I think that would really be counterproductive to what we're trying to do.
I think that feeds into the problem on a national level with police and firefighters, first responders in general. I mean, emergency medical service, doctors, nurses, emergency dispatchers. There's a stigma behind mental health evaluation treatment. So, being encouraging and supportive in that environment, I think, is really important. And using that gentle influence as opposed to mandated. And what good is it going to do if you have somebody that's dead set against it and you're not seeing it? to force them to go to talk to somebody totally, what are they gonna do? Well, you know, I mean, if they don't wanna be there, you're not gonna get anything out of it. It's a touchy subject.
I mean, it just sounds like a liability though. Like if you have them if they've experienced something tragic, right? And say they don't go counseling or they don't get assistance or support, and say they go back out and something bad happens, they're gonna say, why didn't that officer get counseling? Why didn't they get support? It sounds like a liability to me.
I think that everybody processes grief and trauma very differently.
Absolutely, and Chris has great things set up. Like, no doubt about that. He works hard to keep things, you know, like he just mentioned everything, and I fully 100% believe he does all that. It's just Chris is one human being, and, you know, having a support system outside of that. I mean, this is just one aspect of everything, but it sounds like what you've been doing the past few months is really forward moving. But there are just there's a few aspects that still need to be addressed in-house. Like mental health, great. I'm glad you guys are expanding and moving upon that. Chris and I have had conversations about mental health in the police department. Our subcommittee really pushed for mental health for police officers for the reform board. So we're with you. We get that. And that's wonderful.
Does anyone have anything they wanted to share before
Or
I ask another question? Carol?
Well, I do. I mean, I've had uniformly wonderful experience with OPD. And, Doug Brenner, the retired chief, has been on the board of First Night and helped out with LEAF. And I mean, I just owe so much debt of gratitude to OPD. The thing that disturbed me in watching that video was, I guess, the atmosphere on Main Street, and B, the lack of cooperation and mutual respect between the community members that were there in OPD. I just found that disturbing because in that situation it would seem like everybody would be on the same page. People are, you know, one guy's causing trouble, and I think everyone there probably wanted him to be taken care of, but no one was helping your police officers, and you know, things just seemed to be a series of misunderstandings that just got out of control. And Paul actually had, you know, a proposal that if there was a way for us to help you, being the Commission on Human Rights and Community Relations, develop some kind of a task force or something that would involve the colleges and the sports teams and the local people and the students and, you know, the police officers, to try and get together somehow and talk about ways that we could tone down that atmosphere that's pretty unpleasant for everyone, you know, late at night on Main Street, because we're going to have a whole bunch of new residents here pretty soon. We're going to have big apartment buildings going up, maybe businesses staying open later. And I don't think that kind of rowdy thing that we all are familiar with people laying on the ground and vomit and girls leaning in doorways, is a necessity here in the future. So
Yeah.
is there a way we could all work together?
Yeah, Carol and I agreed that it would be nice if there's some kind of long-term program or an outreach from the police department to communicate better with young people, given the way this social media event was projected. It indicated there's an awful lot of hostility and even racism on the part of the young people. And if there's some way to kind of regularize interaction between OPD and young people in the area, not just the high school, but other high schools and BOCES and perhaps the college too. But getting some regular effort on the part of the OPD to interact with young people to kind of make better communications and overcome the stereotyping on both sides.
One of the things that I'm working on now, and I've pushed to my first line supervisors, is that I want the officers to be out of the cars and around the people on where they congregate, so they can talk and get a feel for who the officers are and be exposed to them. We've been in a difficult staffing position for a very long time. I'm hoping to have some of that alleviated come maybe the end of December. So I'm looking forward to being able to have more of those discussions. And I have some plans for how, moving forward, we can get more into the communities.
And there's got to be a way the community can help you do your job, you know, with some type of reinforcement or more sanctions from the college for bad behavior down here on Main Street, or, you know, just some.
So just last week, I met with University Interim Police Chief William Henn and their disciplinary staff on college campus, and we spoke about their procedures and how it is that I can best help bolster their monitoring of off-campus student behavior. They've been wonderful, as well as Donald DePass from Harvard College. We've got a very, very good relationship. We meet every Monday. So that in itself has been helpful. I think, speaking from experience, we've had a very good first year. This semester's been excellent. Student behavior's been very good. I think by and large we've had really good voluntary compliance with the bars downtown. So I'm excited. I think that we have a lot of we're well situated moving forward.
Yeah, I think, and I feel like everyone would probably agree, is that our moving forward, our number one objective should just be addressing the culture around policing and interactions, both ways, obviously. And I think that's kind of where Carol and Paul were like looking towards, is the idea of maybe, I don't know what that looks like, but formally addressing culture around policing, and that would kind of ease my mind for my concerns earlier about ensuring police officers are well understanding with interacting with the public's view and perception of them, and how the department itself is actively trying to prove that perception as wrong or incorrect. So I like the fact that you were saying police officers will be interacting with civilians like non-calls, just personally. But it would be nice to know a little bit more, like see a little bit more from the department in transparency-wise. So I know you had mentioned about the initiatives you guys are already implementing, somehow informing the public about those things, not keeping everything so hush-hush. Like the building itself is very closed off, which creates a barrier for people.
I don't
which
even have a window.
Right.
I live in a dungeon.
So the idea that the public can have access to and comprehensible access to what's happening within the department, put some minds at ease, and hopefully that will in turn keep tensions a little bit lower when officers are arriving. So it just seems like a win-win for everyone. And hopefully the commission can help with that public perception and controlling the narrative around police interactions moving forward.
I think there's a few trainings, not to interject, that Captain Chief Witzenberg is working on that I think we're not releasing details about yet, but I think it'll be things the commission is excited about. They're very community focused, much to your point.
Yeah. Well, small town policing is a little bit different, and that's a luxury in the sense that, you know, you can control crime before it happens. Hopefully, if you have good rapport with your citizens.
You know, you're in many ways, you're absolutely correct. And I think that we've tried to really be much more proactive, especially in the neighborhoods where we've had neighbor complaints regarding large parties, and making, pre-weekend visits to houses to introduce ourselves to, whether it be student housing fraternities, places that we've had issues with in semesters past, so that, they get an idea of what our expectations are and what the community expectations are, and talking to them about talking to their neighbors, just really having a good neighbor talk. I think that's been pretty effective. We haven't had the number of large parties this year, but that could be a culmination of things, including COVID. Nothing happens overnight. I'm willing to have a discussion with anyone. I think I've been pretty accessible. Most people that call my office get a phone call pretty quickly. I even talk to people who just like to shout at me. So.
And that kind of like neighborly connection is going beyond the college students, correct? Like
Oh, sure.
everyday citizens, even those with mental disabilities.
I've actually been working with the Community Solutions Panel, which includes people from SPOA, Single Point of Access, Otsego County Mental Health, Addiction and Recovery Services, and trying to manage some of our higher volume recidivistic people. We're still really in our infancy, but we're starting to work with the groups now and maybe seeing what they can do to aid us. But it's been an exciting period of time, and I'm looking forward to seeing the panel really start to grow.
Does anyone else want to? I know I've like monopolized a lot of the conversation.
If it's okay, I want to step back a minute. In the video, the citizens are complaining about one specific officer. And then they play by play what that officer does. I was just wondering what your feelings were on that.
When you have an officer that cares about their job and is active, they're not ignoring problems as they come up, and in some instances can lead to people not liking them because they themselves may not be conducting themselves in an upright, forthright manner.
They're shop owners. They own businesses on Main Street.
They could be talking about stuff that they've heard. I don't know. What I do know is that this particular officer that they are referencing is a very professional, highly motivated police officer, and I think really was wrongly labeled in this instance.
So you didn't take anything to heart about what people were saying?
Well, yeah, I take it to heart.
For him.
But at the same time, we can discuss how maybe there's a public perception, but at the same time, I've been part of that. I've had people cursing my name walking down the street doing nothing but going to get a cup of coffee. So that could be difficult because you have no control over the way that people perceive you. To some degree, people have their own opinion and they formulate that, and they stick to it in some instances. So,
Okay.
it's
Any,
kind of
like-
uniform as a whole could be very stereotypical, right? We look like New York City Police Department. We look like Binghamton City Police Department. We look like Kingston and Poughkeepsie City Police Department. So a lot of people come from other areas, and we're just the same as everyone else. So. I'd like to think that we try to run a much more community-oriented police department that cares about the people that we serve, that we give the best service that we can to people that are in need that come to us. Try to reference and resource opportunities for assistance for them in any way that we can, and hopefully send them away with a really positive experience. But in some instances, the positive experience is not something that they're after.
Well, I mean, it would have taken just a few minutes to go over and speak to the people who took the video, who were very public about who they were and that they own businesses on Main Street. I mean, somebody could have gone over and said, hey, we were curious. Why is this what you think is going on? Because then, gives you an alternate perspective. That would help with community policing.
I believe we've spoken to the person that's taken the video on several occasions.
Okay.
I can't speak to him on this one.
Okay. We were also curious why Jonathan was taken into custody the next day, not that evening.
But the two officers that observed it that night were otherwise indisposed with what they had, and I think they were focused on that. The officers that were left behind didn't view what they viewed, so they were able to go back and look at the body camera video and make a determination as to who he was and pick up the pieces from that. He would have been the original subject of attention had we not been distracted.
So they just recognized him, and he just chose to came in and be arrested.
I can't speak to exactly how it worked out, but I know he was identified by a member of the agency. I don't know if he
Yeah, I think a lot of what we were feeling was just the extreme, very quick escalation of what happened, not really taking into account how Isaiah was feeling in that moment since he was just breaking up a fight and everything was like high energy, and then to have 4 officers roll up demanding things, and as a black male who he admits to being drunk, who's just broken up this fight, may have perceived the actions of what was happening. Everything happened very quickly. So I think you were saying a softer approach by stopping further away. What would that have done for the situation?
I have no idea. We're talking about hypothetical. I have no idea how we would react.
No, you mentioned the softer approach.
That's an option.
Okay,
It
right.
doesn't mean that it would have changed the outcome.
Of him being arrested.
Correct.
So, in the future, if you were to stop further back, it would give the officers more time to collect information about what's going on the scene before they arrive at the problem. I think Shannon's just wondering what stopping further back would hopefully achieve.
It could be a mixed bag. Maybe we've given somebody enough time to formulate a plan to do something more serious. I don't know. You're asking me to be a predictor of human behavior in an instance like this, and it's not possible for me to do that.
I mean, I'm just saying what you said.
We offered as an option something to consider, given what they see at the time. But I don't know that would have changed the outcome.
Okay. Because, for me, a citizen watching this video, because the cams weren't released, so all I have to go off is like 3 or 4 videos from private people. This all escalated very quickly. The citizens of the scene, it didn't look like any of the officers were really talking to them to try to figure out what's going on, even though repeated people were yelling that it's not him and that he was detained and tased anyway. So I guess my feelings in that are that,
Just to be clear, he was not arrested for anything that he did prior to the officer's arrival on scene.
which is beautiful because you're making my point. If they had arrived in a different manner and de-escalated the situation, he wouldn't have had to have been arrested or tased.
I don't know that that's the case in this instance.
But we will never know.
We discussed other options, but I don't know that would have changed the outcome.
I like your softer approach idea, and maybe it just needs like some, it just needs some development, because possibly in the softer approach, if you take those extra few moments, like when you're angry, right? We teach people when you're angry, you don't say the first thing that comes to your mind. You wait a second, right? Maybe when they're rolling up to something like that, because at that point it was just people being rowdy on the sidewalk. I get that there was a dude who pulled out a 10-inch knife, but that was a little bit different. So for this situation with people, because we're a college city.
I don't know that we're talking about hypotheticals, and we had a gentleman just a few years ago that was alleged to have a gun and was going to kill himself on Main Street. And the officers were able to use an approach that took him by surprise, and they were able to disarm him. Had they taken a soft approach in that case, it could have ended very differently. What I'm saying is I don't know what people are set upon doing when they see us. So it makes it very difficult for me to say in this instance a softer approach would have worked. I've seen it go both ways.
I was just re-suggesting with a little bit of what you suggested. We were like working together here. Like, I'm saying that's a great idea, and that maybe there are certain situations where we can take that and build upon it and have something in place where if we just take that moment to breathe and recognize like who's on scene, because the young man who had the gun, was he known to you?
No.
So he was fresh dude, never run across him before, ready to kill himself on Main Street. He He had like no prior contact with OPD.
No.
That's a tough call. So you're making those tough calls, though we are a college town, so we are continually dealing with rowdy, drunk individuals all over the city. And our officers are trained fairly well in how to address and manage and handle that. So,
We had another instance where a college student had menaced, not, I don't know, he might have been a college, he was a college student, menaced his girlfriend with a knife during a domestic dispute. She was able to get out and determine that there was nobody else in there to be a liability. I was contacted on the phone by the sergeant. This was kind of a standoff situation. I told him to leave. He talked to him on the phone, and he said he wasn't gonna hurt anybody else, but he didn't want us coming in the house. So at that point, do we kick the door in and force a potentially bad situation to make it worse? Or do we say, this is out of our control, at this point, we're not gonna force this to make it into a worse situation, right? This is a difficult situation to be in, because 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that's exactly what would have happened. And we're seeing more and more in the public eye where police are taking a lot of heat for doing exactly that. So our mindset is always on de-escalation and not escalating to begin with. But we still don't have control over the people's reactions to us. We can control how we react to them as best we can, but we really are we are reacting to their behavior. And in this instance, that's exactly what happened.
anybody else? Go ahead,
This
Reverend
doesn't
Murray.
have to do with that incident, but I just read in the newspaper, I think yesterday, it might have been this morning, about the close of the reform work you've been doing. And you were, Acting Chief, you were just talking about how you always try to de-escalate, and yet in the newspaper report, and maybe it wasn't accurate, I think you've ordered to buy a couple more tasers?
I'm sorry?
That-
Oh, yes.
Is that correct?
Yeah,
Why
we've
do
got
we-
more tasers.
Why do we
Well,
need more of them if we only use them a couple times a year and we're trying to use them less?
Well, if we have 4 tasers for the whole department, and we have one officer that doesn't have one, there's the potential for things to escalate beyond what we'd like them to. So that is a very important, less lethal option for us.
Okay.
And having the officers with that less lethal option at their disposal is critical. In the instance where the college student with the knife, only the sergeants at that point had been issued tasers. And when I arrived on scene, it was literally about 2 seconds. It's a very good chance that young man would have lost his life. And that was a selling point for the tasers, because we were able at that point to stop him from any forward movement. But there were people actively drawing weapons in that moment.
Right.
So we were able to de-escalate that through the use of less lethal force. It's a very important option. And these happen to be a much better replacement for the now antiquated tasers that we currently have.
Okay.
But I think it's in the interest of public safety and the community for us to have that option.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
How many intoxicated or aggravated arrests do we have a year?
Oh, boy. Year to year is different. This year is very different than years past. When I first started, there were periods of time we were having multiple stabbings on Main Street a week. We were having armed robberies on Main Street. Things have changed dramatically within this community over the last 24 years. As far as actual aggravated, intoxicated incidents, I would have to go through line by line and look for them. I don't really know right off the top of my head, but things have been drastically different on a couple of really important issues, like mental health, for instance. Our transports in 2019 and 2020, year to date as of, I think, August 8th, combined were what we had for this year alone. So I don't know what to attribute that to, whether it's COVID fatigue. I just don't know. I'm not a social scientist, but I know that that's what we're dealing with as far as numbers. And that's something that I've communicated with the Community Solutions Panel on, they've been very supportive. One of the initiatives that we've got coming, and I'm hoping in November, is a direct link to MCAT, the Mobile Crisis Assessment Team, through a tablet. So they will be able to do mobile crisis assessments face-to-face, so to speak, which I think would be a big improvement over what we currently have, and that would be on a 24-hour basis.
Great.
Curious, when you have a mental health call and they need to be transported, did they have to be arrested to be transported?
So technically, it's not a criminal arrest, but it's a custodial arrest under the MHL, the mental health law. So we, for the sake of records purposes, would put that as an arrest report.
So that's why the arrest of people with mental health concerns is so high.
Right. There's really no other way to get around that because we are taking physical custody of the person in direct direction of a physician or community services, the head of community services for the county, or based upon some sort of ideation of self-harm or harm to others.
Yeah, I think, outcomes are always unknown, like you said, right? We can't possibly know every outcome for every single thing, but I think like building blocks and making the steps necessary so that we can have possible, probable, better outcomes. I understand that the issue with Isaiah or Mr. Montgomery was one piece of the puzzle of this greater thing that you work with and deal with. But viewing it was upsetting, and it came off blatantly excessive. A great use of force. And that's just me, I'm not speaking for anybody else here, just for me. And so my first thought is, the de-escalation, which we've already spoken about, and how can we get the training necessary for that? Or how can we get them into something, or get our officers into a space where when they are approaching a scene, it's, okay, we have a black male on scene. What is his current feelings probably going to be, about officers rolling up on scene on him right now? Also, again, this is just me, not necessarily anyone else here, but we have people in the community who are being vocal, not just in that video, but in other spaces about issues and concerns they're having with specific officers. And you do run it like a family. And it's for a reason, but like sometimes it can't hurt to step back and say, what are these issues and concerns? Like even if it's just to say that I heard them and we addressed them.
I'm confident in saying I've been the most aggressive police lieutenant in this department's history regarding disciplinary matters, because one person cannot disrupt the family. So if I have a disciplinary issue, I will pursue it aggressively so it doesn't put a stain on the department, which is the rest of the family. So I'm not about the individual here, I'm about the collective. So if there's an issue, it's going to be addressed.
If we can explore further into the community of people who may not necessarily be bringing things directly to you because they're scared or frightened or don't know what's going to happen to them if they do.
We have the report form for
You-
police officer complaints doesn't come to me.
So, just for instance, I physically know human beings in this city who have not reported situations because they don't want anything to come back on them. And I'm not the only one. Other people on this committee have received information from individuals who felt safe going to them because they were unsure what might happen. So it's not just me, it's other people as well who are in spaces where they might be able to do something about it. And I guess that's really where a lot of my concern lays, is you have some people who in the community who are bridges for others. And it's like, I was kind of hoping that because this video was out and called people, he was like trying to put things on the table, maybe you guys would step back and take a look at it, but you guys, haven't really done that. You haven't really addressed.
think like on a larger scale, it's addressing the mistrust within the community with the officers. And just, again, just being more public about your intentions to relieve some of those thoughts or concerns about, you know, misusing drugs, alcohol, being over aggressive. I think those kind of concerns that we hear throughout the community, members that come to us as like that bridge. But I kind of already said that, making sure that your actions about improving everything is public and the public is involved in what's going on, because after all, you know, you guys serve the public, and in return, this public can help you in ensuring you stay safe and your work is done more effectively. So I think hopefully moving forward, again, always about action steps, using us as a tool to help shape that narrative around policing, and then us in return helping you see outside of like the police family and options about mental health and public opinions and the other side of it.
It's not even necessarily opinion. I mean, we don't have to put officers' names on the table, but in the like, just for instance, without putting any names on it, I had a mom come to me and say that her teenage son got elbowed in the head on purpose in the back of a patrol car. Now, this was a few years back. This is not, I just want to preface that. But she had asked, and she was told that because there was no mark, there wasn't anything she could do about it. So she didn't go and make a complaint. She felt like she went as far as she could. She was appalled and wanted to do something, and she just felt she hit a dead end and didn't know what else to do but talk to someone, and she ended up speaking to me. Now, those situations are occurring just because you're not hearing, and you weren't, I don't even believe you were on, you know what I'm saying, yeah, in charge. But they're occurring, you're just not hearing about them. People, we're talking about a population that isn't necessarily comfortable with coming that far. So you need these bridges, you need the bridges to go there.
I appreciate that.
May I just make one brief comment? I know you're looking before. I just wanted to mention that, you know, through the CAB process, Community Advisory Board, which, you know, several people in this room were very active, and, you know, we heard very clearly that the feedback from the community was that we need to do a better job about being sure that there were more options available for people who had feedback, positive or negative, about the police department. So we really are taking a look at that as a transformative process, and I think that the commission would be happy, you know, to hear maybe the steps that we've taken. So I know some of you have mentioned that you've been reading in the paper, following the CAB report, what's being adopted. So in the past, what existed was a form on a website or a direction to come into the department to report any sort of complaint about the police department to the department. The chief, acting chief, you know, made the decision that he no longer wanted complaint forms to be addressed specifically to him. He requested for our IT director to have those complaint forms sent directly to the city administrator and to me. They're no longer going directly to the department. The acting chief and no one from the police department are actually even copied. From there, the city administrator and I, you know, kind of begin an investigation of the complaint, which can include speaking with the witnesses, speaking with members of the department, involving our legal counsel, involving other subject matter experts. So we are really changing the way, based on that community feedback, that there were some concerns about the way that things were happening. That was, we heard it loud and clear that we needed to do a better job. I think that the other part of this, you know, one positive thing that came out of the CAB process is the formation of the Community Police Board, which is to be a 5-member board. Exactly how they will function is still being considered, but they will have a very powerful voice in reviewing investigations that have been completed by the city administrator and myself, and telling us, no, we're not satisfied with the result, go back, do a different job, you know, do it differently, and or reporting that dissatisfaction directly to the common council who represents the city at large. So I think that, you know, again, as much as I said on a completely different topic, progress can always be made, we can always do a better job. I still think that that holds true in this case, but I do think even in the last few months, we have started to take a hard look at that process and to try to do things to build that trust with the community. And how you build that trust is, of course, through transparency, which is a word I've heard several times in this room. So I do think that we have made some steps in the right direction. Again, I think if we continue to work in partnership with the commission, with our to-be-created community police board, our elected officials and the department, I just think that we can only move forward. So I don't know if any of that's helpful to provide context, but I do think that, again, based on that CAB review and the very clear feedback from the community that we all took seriously, I think that we've made progress.
It sounds fantastic. It sounds like you have and you've heard. Now we just have to get it in motion and make those steps.
Sure, so I think
That's something that we're working very hard on council to do, is getting this moved forward as fast as we can, because like you and Deandra, I've been involved with this process since the beginning. And I've heard many community voices, and I think this will be a big step in increasing that communication and building that trust. And it's now on council to get this passed.
Is there like an expected time for it to be?
My sincerest hope is by October, by this coming month. We meet twice a month, is my sincerest hope. And unfortunately, I'm only one vote, but I will be advocating for this because it's important that this gets done.
should note in the report that's before the council, there is a suggested implementation timeframe for each of the initiatives that were identified. So there is a specific timeline that has been identified. Granted, the council has not taken any formal action to adopt it, but there is a prescribed timeline for getting that community police board in motion, created, members appointed, just like there is a timeline for every initiative in the report.
So would you say you're kind of already in the process of headed that way? Of headed what or CAB committee, regardless of whether it's voted on or not, you guys are headed in that direction?
Well, I think ultimately it would be up to the council, not to speak for you, but the mayor, I believe it would be up to the council to adopt the policy, which what would be the nexus and the impetus for creating that committee. I don't know what the staff.
Not necessarily the committee.
Shannon, let me answer that. I mean, steps have been taken, as Katie just described. Steps were taken without it being, having the plan approved in terms of the flow of complaint, that it goes to the staff, it does not go to the police. However, there is much more to that plan that does require official approval by the council.
Okay.
The creation of the community police board, which is a very, very major step. I mean, this is a board that will have a very, very powerful voice. They will have access to all of the materials, data, details of an investigation that takes place about a complaint. They will be able to say they agree with the way the investigation was conducted and they agree with the outcome, or they will be able to say they do not. Now, this is a board that will be authorized by the council, by the mayor, to have a voice. And they will be able to come and say to the council, we disagree with this investigation. We disagree with the outcome. We disagree with the way it was conducted. That is a powerful thing. They can say that to the council, they can say that to the city administrator, they can say that to the personnel director, they can say it to the mayor, they can say it to the people. So that in itself is a very powerful thing. Now, some of the details about the operation of that board are still being worked out, but there are many. I think the plan is a good plan. I know that, I said this last night or whenever we had a council meeting a couple nights ago. There is no doubt that some people will look at it and say it hasn't gone far enough. There's also no doubt that some people look at it and say it's gone too far. We all have very different perspectives. We all come from different places. We've all had different life experiences. We all see it differently. So I don't expect everybody to agree upon this. I think it's a good start. I think there's real reform in it. I think there's real change. I think there's real accountability that didn't exist before. I think there's real giving the people a voice that didn't exist before. Is it perfect? No, but there's change. Now we have to get it approved by the council. Needless to say, the council is a political group. Each person has one vote. Each person has, a voice. And we are working hard to get this approved. I have pushed that, I stated that a vote for it will be on the agenda for the next council meeting, even though there were some objections from some of the council members the other night of me saying that. But I've said enough is enough, and it doesn't have to be approved unanimously. It only takes 5 votes to approve it, It's, we know and we watch Congress, nobody worries about getting 100%. You get a majority. So my intent is to have this on the agenda in the week after next and get it voted on, and my expectation is that'll be approved. I think it's a big step forward, and it's also not the end. This document is, like everything else, it will be a living document. And we will learn, and things will change, and we may find some things don't work, and we'll change them. We may find some things work great, so we'll embellish them. My expectation is, the council can always make changes to this document at any time. It's not the end. So it's a starting point. I think it's a good one. And I want to also point out that this was really community driven. We had, thanks to you and Luke and the people who were on the board, you brought in dozens, maybe 50, 60 community members who all had their input into it. Not every one of them got everything they wanted, but they all had their input into it. So this was really community driven. So I'm proud of it. It's not perfect. It's not everything I would want, but I'm still proud of it.
Aside from some frustrating reasons why it's taken so long, some I think are very positive in that, for example, we put a call out to all the subcommittee chairs to comment on it. And one of the reasons it has taken longer and we've continued to push our deadline back is because we really wanted to be deliberate about it and ensure that we're doing the best that we absolutely humanly possible from a legal standpoint, from an HR standpoint, from a what is possible to ask physically of a human being to do standpoint. However, I'm glad to hear that it will be on the next agenda for a vote.
Yeah, and it was wonderful that it came back to me so I could bring it back to my subcommittee and we could go over what new had come up. And so the process has been extended, but awesome that it's going to be up for a vote because it is a living document, and it'll be great to be able to make shifts and make changes to it. A lot of people, like you said, have worked really hard. Long nights.
And tough conversations on all ends. And
anybody want to mention any questions? Anything new?
Just thanks and
Yeah,
gratitude
thank you
for
so much.
spending
It was-
this
And I don't want, and I neglected to point out when I said, this is community driven, and thank all the people who worked on this. The police department worked on this as well, and they were partners in the creation. I'm sure that the chief did not agree with everything and see it from the same perspective that everybody else saw, but he was a partner in the project. And so this is not something that was done to the police department. This was something that was done with the police department. I think that's important to recognize.
And just a point of order, acknowledging how especially frustrating it must have been for Acting Chief Witzenberg. He came in on this fairly late into the process, and his I think, at least from my perspective, has worked hard with us. So thank you for that, because from my understanding, you weren't necessarily involved at the beginning, but when things turned out the way they did, you became involved. So thank you for
It's
jumping
been
in.
a very educational year.
Well said. Yeah.
Okay. Alright. If there are, we're going, so regular meeting we'll have next month, since it doesn't fall on a holiday. So that'll be October.
28th.
We'll resume normal meetings back then in October.
Could we, for the next meeting, we're talking about commission rules, or committee rules? Or like
Mission statement,
vision statement and stuff like that,
that's what
right?
we're gonna talk about. It was in Joyce's minutes, so.
Okay.
October 28th, right?
Yep.
28th. All right, so October 28th. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Acting Chief Witzenberg. Thank you, Greg, for being here. Katie and Mayor, thank you for being here. 8:20. We are adjourned at 8:20.
I can't believe you came to a really deserving medal.
You do have a medal right in my head.
Pickleball court order.
What do you want in the minutes?
Huh?
What do you want in the minutes? I didn't take any notes.
They're all in
Just that we had a general